Sam Alberry, associate pastor at Emmanuel Church in Nashville, has resigned for inappropriate relationship with another man. Sam Alberry on this slice of fresh bread. Welcome to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville, with Pastor Brandon and Pastor Keith. Well, thanks for clicking on Fresh Bread. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world. Fresh Bread podcast 146. And today, we're going to wrestle with a pastor. Well, he was an associate pastor at Emmanuel Church in Nashville, his name is Sam Alberry. And he is a homosexual Anglican priest who became associate pastor at Emmanuel Church. I don't know how many years ago, but that's a church, I think, mainly pastored by Russell Moore and a few other guys. But he was part of that church, and he also was part of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. But in 2022, he was involved with another man, what they call an inappropriate relationship. And then now here in 2026, he has resigned from Emmanuel Church because of what happened there. And so, wow, a lot happened there. And Sam Alberry has become kind of the voice. And I can't remember when it started, but I do remember, oh, by the way, I'm Pastor Keith. The other guy over there on the other side of the mic is Pastor Brandon. Pastor Brandon, when we were in seminary, I think this is when Sam Alberry came out and was talking about it's okay for people and Christians especially to have same-sex attraction, that's not a sin unless you act upon it. Do you remember that? Is that about the time 2015, somewhere around in that area?
Yeah. I just want to maybe I don't know if correct's the right word, but
oh, you going to correct me?
Well, Sam Alberry, from what I understand, has come out and said that homosexuality is a sin, and so it's not so much that you said he was homosexual. Has he had homosexual tendencies? Yes, but is he a guy that has come out publicly and tried to justify homosexuality? No. But for him, it's more at the level of temptation, more at the level of, something that I can still kind of entertain those thoughts, but at the same time, as long as I don't act on those things, I'm okay. Like, as long as I'm celibate, I'm okay. And so I just want to be clear that, unless you know something that I don't know, I don't think he's been, at least as far as I know, a practicing homosexual. Now, with these new revelations, definitely, and it didn't say that he actually, was involved directly in a homosexual relationship, but that he was in an inappropriate relationship. Now, I don't know what that means. They didn't define that, and it's kind of probably similar to the Steve Lawson thing where, it could be similar to the Steve Lawson thing where, he didn't, from what I understand, he didn't engage in anything sexual with her, but he had a relationship that was inappropriate with her. And so, someone that's not his wife. And so, that's kind of my understanding of it, but unless you have some other understanding.
Well, I've dug into it a little bit, and this relationship happened in 2022, and he came and confessed to the church, the elders or whatever they have there running. I'm not sure if they are elder run, that he had done this, and they said, okay, we'll take your word for it. They kind of moved on. But then
that was a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago. Yes. That
right.
He actually did confess it. Yes, and confess that he had this relationship. My understanding is that he didn't confess everything, though. So I don't know, but I don't know what he confessed. I don't know what he didn't confess, and and I don't know what happened. So unless you know more than I do.
No, I was just going to say, and now in 2026, other things have come out that had happened. So they went back to talk to him, and that's when he resigned.
Yes.
And so let me ask you a question. I thank you for clarifying that, but is there a difference between, let's say I have same-sex attraction to I guess that's, I have an attraction to a male. Doesn't that make me a homosexual, or does there have to actually be, an act involved before you are considered a homosexual? Isn't just same-sex attraction?
There doesn't have to be an act involved. Yes. But it sounded like you were saying that he was a practicing homosexual, and he is not acting homosexual. And maybe you didn't mean that. And
no, he's never practiced it. He's never even.
Well, that we know of.
Yeah.
He has called it sinful. That acting on homosexual tendencies is sinful. He has been clear about that. What he hasn't been, the issue is that he hasn't been as, clear about the temptation side of it. And so, yes, I mean, it's just like committing adultery with a woman. I don't have to physically lay with her, with a woman who's not my wife. I don't have to physically lay with her in order to commit adultery, because Jesus says in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says that looking upon a woman with lustfully is the same thing. Like it rises to the same level. And so, for sure, having a same-sex attraction and entertaining those thoughts is sinful, just even more so really than adultery, because I can, there is a right way to have a sexual relationship with a woman that's right and good, by being married and having a relationship with my wife. I can have an attraction to a female that be right and ordered. That's what God wants us to do. And yet when you look at homosexuality, there's no redeeming value to any of it. Like it's all disordered. And so even having a same-sex attraction to someone is disordered. It's sinful. And so it is different than adultery in that sense, but it's the same in the sense of if I entertain those thoughts, and we can kind of get into the nature of, we've talked about it in the past in terms of temptation and even looking at Christ being tempted and how that's different. And so, I mean, that's something I think we need to really explore again, as we think about, Sam Oliveri and where he's at.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna get into that with you, because I think this is what I remember. I distinctly remember being in seminary, and this came out. He talked about same-sex temptation is not a sin unless it's acted upon. And I think John Piper then came out and agreed with that. And so that was this big thing. I remember the guys talking about it in seminary. And so let's talk a little bit about that. When does a temptation become a sin?
Well, okay. So, I think we have to really think through what a temptation is, and so peirasmos is the Greek word that can mean testing, trial, or even an enticement to sin. But that is not inherently sinful. And so, it may come from, it's something exterior to us. So as an example, if I see a beautiful woman and that woman is a temptation, because it's external to me, just seeing her and that being a temptation doesn't mean that I've sinned.
Okay.
Where it becomes a sin, and I don't know, what the exact line of this is. I don't know what the exact line, but there has to be a line. Well, where it becomes a sin, clearly a sin, is when I begin to entertain thoughts that I shouldn't, that are forbidden. So, when I'm looking at a woman and I begin to undress her in my mind, or if I begin to think about acts that I might commit with her, I have then crossed the line into sin. And so it's the temptation is something external. And I think that James, and we've talked about this probably on several different occasions, I think James 1:14 and 15 is important here, because, James says in that text that, each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived or has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And so yeah, I mean, there can be, there's a temptation, and I've used it in the past, like a bass that's laying below a log, and you have the lure that comes by. That lure is tempting to the bass, but he lays under that log and doesn't strike, he doesn't engage in it. But it's when he strikes that it becomes a problem, and that's where he becomes carried away. And I think that's the same thing that happens with sin. The temptation to sin is that I see something, and then I act upon it. Not necessarily physically act upon it, but I act upon it in my mind and heart. And I do things with my mind that, even if I didn't do them physically, that's the same. It's sin. It's the same thing, according to the Bible. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And why I'm making that, that distinction is that, that there's a distinction between temptation, an external temptation, and a sinful desire. Right. I can be tempted, externally, as it's an external solicitation to sin. But then there's a internal desire, inclination toward that evil that ends up being the problem. And that's what I have to fight. I have to, as an example for me, if if I saw a beautiful woman, the tendency would be in that direction to be sinful about my thoughts. And so I have to recognize that about myself, and I have to fight against it. And I have to do whatever it takes to not go down that path. And so it's the same thing really with homosexual desire. The difference with homosexual desire is that that's something that's forbidden in all circumstances. It's not even something, no matter what they try to tell us, getting married in a quote unquote a monogamous relationship doesn't make homosexuality right.
And that's what I was going to ask you, is that as men, we are born sinners, but we're also born with an ingrained attraction to females. And so male and female attractionness is going to be there. And so again, there's temptation, but like you would just explain that there's a certain line that when you cross, it is a sin. But let's talk about homosexuality then, because can somebody be born a homosexual, and is that their normal tendency? And so they're just doing the normal thing that the heterosexual male is doing.
I don't know. I don't think biblically that people are born homosexual. I think they're born sinful. Biblically, that we're all born as sinners, right? In sin, my mother conceived me, Psalm 51, I think. And so yeah, I'm born sinful, but I don't think that people are born with a natural inclination toward homosexuality. I think that that's something that is a learned behavior. That is something that, where you've been shaped by your actions. So, and we see that. It usually starts as a young teen, and you get exposed to pornography, and it maybe even quote unquote heterosexual pornography. But then at some point, you pursue that, and that's a sinful action. And at some point, you get introduced to homosexual pornography, and that awakens that in you, and then you go from there, and it just becomes more and more sinful. And so it really does. Ultimately, James says it brings death. So yeah, that's kind of where I think it can happen. And that's just kind of a general thing. It's not specific to, could be, people have different stories, but that's what it seems to me like, that it seems to be something that, it's been shaped by their sinful responses have been shaped by their actions. And I think we see that with heterosexual men who, that are promiscuous, and women who are promiscuous. And so, they just get into these patterns, and, for whatever reason, and, make decisions and do things that they shouldn't be doing. And it creates a situation where they just go further and further into it. And so I don't think anybody, going back to your specific question, I don't think anybody's born a homosexual. I don't think anybody's born an adulterer, right? We are born sinful with sinful tendencies in those directions. And it may be that some people struggle more with homosexual sin than heterosexual sin. But at the same time, I do think it's a learned behavior.
I agree with that. There is, because when we read scripture, right, it talks about God made them male, female, so the male, female. And I don't know, how would you say, if somebody said to you that I've had the same sex attraction since I was 3? Is that just something, again, that is just a learned?
I think it's still learned. I don't know of anybody that would say that, although they probably would, and probably are. I just haven't been around somebody that said that. But we do have things that start coming out sexually way before puberty. And, I've seen that in people, close to me, that, when you're young, that's what happens. And so you discover yourself, so to speak. And so, yeah, I can definitely see somebody saying that from a very early age that they had these feelings toward, these feelings and inclinations. But the problem is, that's still learned because it's something that they continue to entertain, right? They continue to explore that. And, that's where it becomes problematic. And I think that's why it's still learned, is because we're born as sinners, right? And so, we're exposed to something when we are young. And, I think a lot of, I don't know this. I don't have anything to prove this, but I think I've read this, that most homosexuals those who have struggled with homosexual sin are have been violated in some way in the past, and so that they've actually had someone who's exposed them to these things, and so it's still, like I say, even though there may be tendencies at early age that way, that doesn't. I mean, it's still it's still something it's been increased through exposure.
I do think, and I don't know if you agree with me, there's a reason why the Apostle Paul called homosexual, this kind of behavior as an abomination. It's not normal. It's I guess we would say all sin is sin, but if you look at layers of sin, this might have an extra layer to it because it goes against the way God ordained things to be.
Yes. I mean, it's especially sinful in the sense that it is obviously it's disordered. Like I said it earlier, there's no instance where homosexuality is not a sin. So does that make sense?
Yeah,
whereas
absolutely,
being heterosexual, I can sinfully be sexual for sure. I can commit adultery. I can do a lot of things that way that are disordered, but it's not that heterosexual relationship itself is disordered. In and of itself, it's a good thing, right? And so that does set homosexuality apart.
Yes, and I've heard Sam Alberry say that this is a wonderful time to be alive for same-sex attraction people because they can come out, they can be themselves. This is who God made, the way God made them, and so they can live their life not in the closet, as he would say. We would say that again is embracing a sin right off the bat, and then to be tempted in that way. There's a very, what would we call it? A very thin line between, letting that become part of growing in your life so that you actually act upon it. You know what I mean? We live in such a sexually active society where everybody, adultery, fornication, those things are, I don't know if you could, they're off the scale, I think, as far as what's happening in our society. But then that drags homosexuality into that same platform of, okay, I'm tempted, I'm being celibate, I'm not doing it, but then eventually continuing to be tempted will, lead down the road to actually acting upon it. That's how I looked at it. I don't know how do you feel about that?
Well, what I think is happening is that, there is a temptation for whatever that temptation is, and it ends up, the issue is that it starts with acting upon it in your mind. And, so there's an external temptation. Let's just say at a young age that someone is exposed to homosexual material. That's an external temptation, right? And they haven't necessarily sinned when they're exposed, right? And there's certain feelings that get aroused because of that exposure. They haven't necessarily sinned at that point, but when they begin to entertain it, that's when it becomes problematic. And eventually, if they entertain those thoughts enough, eventually they will tend to act upon those thoughts. And that's the nature of temptation and sin, is that, it doesn't matter if it's homosexuality or adultery or, lying or whatever. I get exposed to something in that way. And then I entertain that thought and continue to roll that over in my mind. And I end up becoming that, I end up, acting upon it. Now it's funny because that does bring up, I try to make that homosexuality is not an identity. It's, you're a person. Your identity is, a human made in the image of God, and your identity is in this fallen world, your identity is being sinful, and so you're separated from God because of your sin. But to say that you're a homosexual or a transsexual, we use those terms because that's the terms that culture understands. But in reality, it's you don't become your sin, right? In terms of your identity, you're still a fallen human made in the image of God. You haven't changed that. That identity doesn't change. It's just that you now are a fallen human that is sinfully engaging in homosexuality or sinfully engaging in adultery, or that's sinfully engaging in deception.
Do you think that Sam Alberry was I don't think he was the main guy, but one of the main guys that has opened the door. You know, like we look at Andy Stanley's church. I mean, they're homosexuals are now serving on the church staff, and they're baptizing homosexuals and things like that. That's kind of opened the door to same-sex attraction as long as you're celibate is okay. Like there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a sin. And so then this embrace of homosexuality has sort of picked up momentum in a lot of churches where, I mean, I've seen there, as churches are looking at homosexuality now, they're not seeing that so much as a sin anymore. It's more, if you're a promiscuous homosexual, that's more of a sin.
Well, I mean, I think there's steps there. I mean, I think that I think where Sam Alberry was at was a step toward where Andy Stanley is at. And where Andy Stanley is at is a step toward where someone who a liberal who would openly, say it's okay to be homosexual, and we welcome you with open arms. I mean, so, that's how I see it. Maybe I could be convinced otherwise, I guess, if somebody has a better way of looking at it. But I definitely see it. I don't see Sam Alberry where, I don't see him as being just completely liberal that's saying homosexuality is okay and we need to accept it. He's not there, but he's a step toward there for sure.
Yeah, no, that's what I was asking. Was he kind of helped pave the way maybe a little bit?
Well, I think he did start, I think he did help have, bring acceptance to the idea of same-sex attraction, and that, that not being disordered. I do think that was an unfortunate outcome of what he's, some of his ministry in that direction. Yes, I do think that.
How about the church? Is it okay to have a man who has same-sex attraction as a pastor or as an associate pastor? Do you think, as long as he's not acting on it, is that something that would be okay with you?
Well, okay. Is it a sin that they've struggled with in the past, and it's something that they've got control over? That they, by prayer and by fasting and by fighting against that sin, they no longer are struggling in that way, then sure. I mean, I don't have a problem with a pastor being in that position. Like I've struggled with sin in my past. And so, and that hopefully that sin has been mortified. And, I've worked hard to get away from that. And so yeah, I mean, I do think that someone who has struggled with same-sex attraction can be a pastor. But again, it has to be, it just as much as someone who struggled with lust in the past toward women can be a pastor for sure if there's repentance and demonstrated fruit in the other way.
I would almost consider him though a homosexual, because if he has same-sex attraction, that's what makes you a homosexual, isn't it?
Well, I mean, he's committing the sin of homosexuality in his mind. I mean, if he's entertaining thoughts of same-sex attraction and normalizing that in any way, then yes, he's practicing homosexuality, even if it's in his mind. And so, again, you get into that whole, you said he's a homosexual. Well, no, he's a sinner made in the image of God, and who is sinning by committing homosexuality in his mind through entertaining same-sex attraction. I mean, I just want to be clear, in terms of our terms and how we frame this. Just want to be very careful and precise in how we frame it.
No, I agree. But what makes us a heterosexual?
Well, hopefully it's that we're either practicing heterosexuality, or at least that we're living in that realm. That's the question is, in terms of singleness, how does that work? How are you a heterosexual in terms of if you're a single person? And the hope would be that that you would realize that if something ever changed and I no longer am celibate, that I would, instead of being a woman, attracted to men, I would be attracted to women as a man. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, I'm just, because I'm still trying to grasp this. If I have same-sex attraction, if I'm attracted to males, to me that would make me a homosexual. Even if I've never been with a male that way, to me that would make me a homosexual, I would think. But I could be wrong.
But what I'm trying to, yeah, I mean, to go back to a heterosexual, someone who is quote unquote heterosexual. I mean, we're all sinners made in the image of God. And so am I heterosexual as an identity? Well, that's not my primary identity. My primary identity is that I'm a sinner made in the image of God. right? I'm an image. I'm made in the image. Let me say it a better way. I'm made in the image of God, even with a fallen nature, and so that's my primary identity. And so I do struggle with, I don't want to be. I'm not a heterosexual as my identity. My identity is I'm a man who loves the Lord, and that's made in His image. That's my identity, and maybe I'm cut. Maybe I'm.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. As far as our Christian, like when we become Christians, our identity is in Christ. It's no longer in, our sex preference. But what I was trying to figure out is that I would consider Sam Alberry, because he has that, unless he got married and into a woman and had, kids, I could understand. I understand what you're saying. I agree with that. If this guy if somebody had tendencies and they, because Paul even talks about that in Corinthians, right? That some of you were like that, right? Some of you were, messing around with, but now you're not anymore. You're a new creation. And so if Sam Alberry's a new creation, but he's still struggling with same sex, and he's never been married, I would still say that I guess he would be I guess you just call him same sex attracted. Maybe not a homosexual, but.
Well, but he is practicing homosexuality in his mind. So yeah, and I may need to correct myself a little bit, because I'm trying to think of scripture, and because I think Paul may say homosexuals, but I think that, I still would push against that being something that you would identify as, because the part of the issue is that, like, can I be a gay Christian? Can I identify as a gay Christian? And I don't think there's any such thing. There's no category.
Right. It has to be a former homosexual Christian, right?
Yeah. Well, can a gay person be saved? Yes. And can they for a time still struggle with that sin as they're fighting against it? Yes.
Well, yeah, like we've always talked about, and you've talked about it, and I agree with it. I think it's a good way to look at it, is that the more you get into sin, the deeper you go. And so the more like weird kind of sin becomes more normal. Eventually the Bible talks about bestiality as like kind of the end of the road. If you get to that point, you are, completely just abandon any kind of normalcy and the way God has ordained things. You're just totally going against God. And I think, homosexuality is kind of in that middle part,
Yes.
If we look at it as a downward staircase, you've got, fornication, adultery, homosexuality, and then bestiality would be, at the bottom of that. And there's a bunch of other things that probably fit in there as well. But yeah, all those things are just it's a factor of your mind going down a road to sin and wanting something and lusting and going after it. That's kind of the way.
Yeah. It's interesting, going back to what we're talking about being a homosexual. It's interesting because if you look at 1 Corinthians 6:9-10, Paul says, "Do you not know the unrighteous will inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, nor homosexuals." And so I definitely understand, how the Bible can identify, and I agree that they identify people by their patterns of sin. And so, that someone who is practicing homosexuality is identified in that sense as a homosexual. But I would still push against it in terms of, because part of the reason why I push against it is because the Bible never, even the question you asked, is, are people born homosexual? And the answer is no, right? And so I don't want to misunderstand that in Paul's economy, a homosexual is one who practices the sin of homosexuality, right? And so he's not born a quote unquote homosexual. He's not identified at a certain level. He's not identified by being a homosexual. He's identified by being a sinner and who is made an image of someone who's made an image of God, who is a sinner. That's the identity.
So is it the world that classifies? We have homosexual, heterosexual, transgender. Is that kind of the world's?
Well, when you start really thinking in terms of that's how they were quote unquote born or made, that's what the world would push. And I'm saying that when Paul when he says that someone's a homosexual, he's not speaking of someone who was born that way or has identifies that way. He's speaking of someone who's practicing that and becomes his identity, like how he's identified in that sense. But ultimately, at a just a more fundamental level, that's not what he is. It's well, ultimately you're a sinner that happens to be, ultimately you're someone made in the image of God who sins, who happens to struggle with that sin, whatever that sin is, but in this case, homosexuality.
So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so can we be, I mean, I've heard people say this. Can someone be born like more susceptible to alcohol or let's say pornography or something like that? Or is that just that slippery slope where you start sinning and you keep going down?
Well, I mean, genetically, are there people who are more predisposed that direction? I think there is something there because, you see that kind of thing running in families and that, it's sometimes that's hard to break. So there is something genetically there, but I don't think, I think that that's again a shaping factor that, I think that maybe there's a predisposition in that direction, but that ultimately it's got to do with, that the things that happen to them and, in their lives that where they begin to entertain those things even more. Does that make sense? Like going back to alcoholism, somebody may have predisposition toward alcohol, but if they never try alcohol, it never becomes an issue.
Yeah. Or drugs like, cocaine or heroin or something. Some people are more they seem to have a lower threshold and it's yeah. And
so, but if they had a lower threshold for those things and they never, as cocaine or heroin or whatever, but they never try it, it doesn't matter. That genetic component there doesn't ever get, it never is an issue.
Right. It's like me. I have that same addiction with donuts, like Krispy Kreme. If I'd never had Krispy Kreme, I wouldn't know it. I would never eat donuts, but
yeah.
So I have to stay away from Krispy Kreme. So that's one of those things. But that's what I was just wondering if a pastor, I guess and I agree with you. I think once you become a believer and you had that former, I had same-sex attractions when I was in my teens and I became a Christian. I don't, now I'm married and have a family. I think that's fine. This Sam Alberry though he was one of those guys. I just think his doctrine would disqualify him the way he was talking about it to me up front, but maybe not. Like, I don't know because
no, I don't see. I think if you look at Grace Bible Church, I don't see that. If he was someone who attended Grace Bible Church, could he be a member? Yes. I think so. Potentially. Well, yeah. I would definitely have my reservations that way. I wouldn't run him off unless he was pushing wrong stuff, like that. But I don't know. In terms of could he ever be an elder? No. He's not qualified. And I don't see him as being qualified. And, and it's interesting because Paul says that, an elder must be the husband of one wife. And so, does that preclude that anybody that's single can't be an elder? No, it doesn't. But at the same time, that there is something to being married and pursuing a heterosexual relationship. So I don't know that it probably doesn't answer your question, but
no, it does. It does. And I think what you were saying is that, yeah, I had many questions. I was thinking about even going down the road of our society today is just fixated on an identity, trying to be different from everyone. And so the door is pretty much open. Like if you're a homosexual, that's fine. And you want to be identified as that. That's great. Also, you can be bisexual. That's even cooler, for young kids. And then now they've got these, furries. I don't know that it just creeps me out where kids are, now they can be a cat or a dog or whatever they want. And it's Romans 1 is what it is. But all this stuff is just exploding in our society. And to have a pastor or associate pastor like Sam Alberry, and then he does kind of have, we don't know what it is. It was an inappropriate relationship, whatever that was. We don't know. But these kind of things tend to happen anytime you open the door, just even a little bit is happening sometimes in the church is that we open the door to some of these, we're going to soften this a little bit because it's going to hurt so many people if we don't. That's where this can lead down this road where, boy, I don't know if we're actually, and I guess I know what you're going to say because I would agree with you. I don't know if this is helping or hurting people by just saying, okay, your sin's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Kind of going back to what I was saying about identifying as homosexual, going back to Paul and, kind of the way he did it. It's interesting because I think Romans 1:32 actually actually kind of sets that up that understanding, because he talks about how these people were filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit. They're malice, they're gossip, slanderers, haters of God, violent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And then in verse 32, he says, and although they know the righteous requirement of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, so they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. And so clearly Paul is delineating there and saying that that those who are violent, that they're practicing violence, right? Those who are greedy are practicing greediness. Those who are full of envy are practicing that, envy. And so, that's the reason why I'm pushing against the identity as homosexuality is because of what we just talked about, which is I'm born that way. I'm identifying as a homosexual. That's what I'm pushing against.
And that's the thing that's now become, I don't know how you push against it, because it's become the major belief in the world is that yes, God does create homosexuals. You are born homosexual.
Yeah,
so you don't have to don't be anything different than that.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I've tried to be careful to say, no, God created you in his image, and you have a fallen nature because of the sin of Adam. And so, that's your identity, right? But your foundational identity is being made in the image of God, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not, your identity is not your sin. You become identified with your sin in the sense of, that's, you practice those things, but at the end of the day, foundationally, we're made in the image of God, and that's our identity. But and even, we talk about race. That's where, people say, well, I'm black, or I'm white, or I'm, Indian, or I'm
Puerto Rican.
Asian. What's that?
Puerto Rican.
There you go. And so, those are just that. I'm not actually foundationally. I'm not those things. That culturally I am, but yes. This is my culture. Like, I'm an American. That's my culture. But at the end of the day, foundationally, everyone is made in the image of God, right? There's no races, right? To identify in that way would be not biblical.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing that I wish we could, or pray that we could get out, is that is not your identity. Like you were saying, our identity is not the color of our skin or our ancestry, right? Because
Yes.
where we come from, it's who we are now. That we are made in the image of God.
Yes.
And also what homosexual, when you teach. When churches start teaching that you're born homosexual, what that does is you start looking through Scripture, and now you look at Joseph, and now they're saying, well, Joseph might have been a homosexual because, remember, he ran from the guy's wife, so he didn't want to, he wanted to be with a man, not with a woman. And then you look at David. Oh, David and Jonathan, they had kind of a thing going there. Jesus was surrounded by all these men, never married. You're looking for something to try and solidify what you believe, and it's not there, but you're trying to find it, and it just messes everything up. It's a doctrine that, yeah. So anyway, final word.
Blue.
Okay. Are you blue today? No. It's a bluebird day.
You said final word, so I decided to give you blue.
You gave me a word. That's the first word that came into your head.
Blue, yeah. I'm looking at my computer screen, and it's a picture of an ocean, so that's why it came to my mind.
Okay. I was going to ask you as we get ready to leave here, were you one of the pastors that were asked to up in the mountains of Tennessee, where they brought a bunch of pastors together and they're talking about how they're going to announce that their aliens are here? Were you part of that group?
No. I'm thankfully no.
Okay.
I was not made privy to that. I did kind of hear about it, that they're talking about how to introduce that to society, and how how to deal with it as a church. So I did see some of that. Did somebody send? Oh, it was one of our listeners that sent, or one of the members of our church that sent that to me.
Perry Stone just announced yesterday that there was a group of pastors that were called together, and they're trying to help them when the announcement comes out. It's supposed to come out in the next 60 or 90 days that there are some, I can't say it without laughing, but I remember Dr. Farnell in seminary. He always talked about the lizard people.
Yeah.
And that's what they are. They're lizard people, and they're actually the ones that created us, mankind, and that we made up the Jesus. And it's really funny, but anyway, we've talked about this many times about don't fall for it. Extraterrestrials, there are no extraterrestrials. They are demons, and they are pretending to be that, and so they're trying to trick us.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard is that they're going to try to basically say that they are people among us, or there are people who are not like us among us. That, and again, like you say, that's or like we've said many times, we feel like that's demonic deception, and that these, if there's anything amongst us that way, if there's UFOs and all that, if that's that, I don't have a doubt of the phenomena itself being something, and yeah, I mean, I do think that demons can do that, and so we see that biblically. So yeah, if that's what happens, if they come out like that, I wouldn't be surprised, and I just want our people, or those who listen to us, I want them to realize that they don't have to be deceived. It's not what they're going to try to say it is. I'll just say it that way.
Yes, do not live in fear of the lizard people, because we know who they are. We know who's behind it. And also, Sam Alberry, I think we would both agree that it's a good thing that he has stepped down as associate pastor.
Yes. And by the way, just you asked for a last word, and I was giving you, I gave you a last word. But to give you a real last word, or at least the last paragraph, we are thinking these things through, and sometimes in real life, like live. I mean, you're asking me questions, and and I'm trying to think it through, and I think, well, I said something, but then I realized that, well, in Scripture it does say that, and why does it say that? And so, we're just kind of working through it as we go in some way. So we're not completely formed in our thinking, even as we talk about these things, and we try to be as biblical as we can. And, there's times we're going to make mistakes, and there's times that we're going to missay things. And so I just pray that our people would be understanding of it, and that we're not trying to be, not trying to deceive or anything like that. So
absolutely. We hope our congregation does not file lawsuits, that they will be forgiving, because this is fresh bread, right? It's right out of the oven. We are in real time baking bread, thinking about these things, and you're getting it fresh out. Getting it fresh right out of Pastor Brandon's brain.
Yeah,
so.
And we could name it cold ice cream instead of fresh bread. Cold ice cream. The problem is ice cream melts, and
yes,
it's not as good anymore.
The bread of life is better, for you. So
yeah. There's
more
too much
nutrition.
Yeah, so we don't want to be feeding you. We want to feed you fresh bread because it's good for you. Not well.
Yes,
really.
That's a good point. That's a good way to end this. And also be leery of, if you see anybody that you're sitting next to and they eat a fly, I would move away.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.